finally, who we see in this book, his name is not mentioned, but I think we're going to begin to see him everywhere in this book, is Jesus. And we see the beginning of this story that is going to begin unfolding as the scriptures move forward, as we come to the crucifixion and what we celebrated, the resurrection of Jesus last Easter a couple weeks ago, right? We see that this is the birthplace of the magnitude of that moment. And so to just give you like a quick history of the Israelites, okay, right? Like you can like read volumes of books on this, and we're going to do it in like a minute and a half, okay? So just know, we're not covering everything here for you literalists, all right? But just give you kind of a big picture. You have God's people, the Israelites, right? And we can go back and we can remember where they were in slavery in Egypt. And Moses gets sent on the scene to lead these people out of slavery. We're going to come back to that phrase over and over a few minutes today. He's going to lead these people out of slavery, leads them across the Red Sea, and he says, we're going to the promised land. But they get to the other side of the Red Sea, and this nation of people, this group of people, God's people, they get to the other side of this Red Sea, and they begin this season of waiting. And in the midst of that season of waiting, God starts to tell them, hey, this is how I want you to live as my people. Right? It's this group of people who've made this journey together. You've been brought out of slavery. You've brought into this new place. He said, this is how we're going to live. And so we get the 10 Commandments, right? And that's kind of this anchor piece to it. But then as we look through those next few books of the Bible, right, after the Exodus where they leave, right, we go into like Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And as we look at those books, they're a little dry when we read them sometimes. But what they really are is they're this guidelines of how God's people are going to live. And so we get into all these weird rules. We get in these rituals and these things that don't make perfect sense unless we really can kind of unpack all of it there for a second. And so as we look at that, they're living in this place, and eventually Moses passes. Joshua comes along as the new leader, and Joshua leads them into the promised land. And Joshua takes them into this new land for God's people and how they're going to live. And so as Joshua leads them into this new place, they start to set up again, okay, how are we going to live as God's people? And so as we look at the Old Testament, then we get to this section of Judges, right? And as we look at this section of Judges, what these judges are is it's this theological history of how God's people, who God has put in place to lead these people, have led the nation. So you have these judges, you have these prophets, you have these people who have been appointed to lead God's people. And some people would use the word that the Israelites up to this point were what we would call a theocracy, right? We're a democracy, right? So we all get to vote, and that makes decisions of who's in charge. But a theocracy means God's in charge, right? And so they live in this theocracy. And God speaks through these different people to guide his people on how to live. Sometimes it makes sense to them, sometimes it doesn't make sense to them, but he reminds them over and over that he is God and they are not. And so these orders are kind of sent down. And so as time goes on, you have Samuel now. As we move into the book of Samuel, see, I told you, we covered a lot there in just like a minute and a half. So Samuel now, as we get to this book of 1 Samuel, you're kind of on the other side of the book of Judges. We're on the other side of all this stuff. And we got all these people who have been leading, and the people get to this place where they start to say, hey, we've lived for a long time with God in charge, but we kind of want to be in charge. And we see what's going on in other places, and we see these battles, and we see these other kings, and, you know, we know that you've been faithful, God, and, like, you parted the sea, and that was cool, but that just seems like an odd strategy for us to live by, that, like, every time we're in a bind, you're just going to part an ocean, right? And so they start, like, doubting, and they start, like, questioning the faithfulness of God, and they say, we know God was faithful then, but is God really going to be faithful now? And so we just feel like we want to have a king like all the other nations have a king. And so they have this conversation with Samuel. And as they walk through this, and as they navigate all of this, what we start to see, and what we're going to see through this whole book, and really, I mean, all the way up to Jesus, is what we see is in that moment, it's a really small decision, but that really small decision is this seed that gets planted that turns into an absolute nation-changing decision. And so for us, when we think about this, this is real for us too. Because a lot of us, right, we know what's right. We know about God's faithfulness in the past. We know that God is going to be with us in the future. But right now, I just really want to do what I want to do. And I'm going to do it. And when we say that, you're like, well, that's dumb. But yeah, we are, aren't we? And we continue to do that over and over and over. And so when we talk about what is it that we're jealous of, What are the things that cause us to live our life differently to pursue that? Those become the places where we start to compromise our convictions. Those become the places we start to compromise our character. Those become the places where we begin to not live by faith and by trusting in who God is, who God has been, and who God says he will be. We begin to live in this place of saying, no, I need to be king right now. And God, I'm going to come back to you once I get it all sorted out. But right now, this is what I want, and I'm not really concerned about the destruction that I'm going to leave in the wake of this decision. Because right here, right now, this is what I want. And as we see this and as we look at this, it can be a thing that starts so simple and so small, and it can grow into so much havoc and destruction in our lives and the lives of people around us. Okay? So name that place where you're jealous. That was a little heavy, wasn't it? Let me lighten us up here for a second, all right? I'm going to give you an example of this that's like crystal clear, but it's not quite as destructive. So when I was in middle school, I thought like a middle schooler. And I had this situation where like I often wanted what other people had, right? And I remember I was about 6th, 7th grade, somewhere in there, going to play baseball. And we would go to play baseball, and I'd always see this kid at the baseball fields. And, you know, he just had, like, cooler cleats than everybody else. His jersey, like, got laundered while ours just got worn for 3 games in a row kind of stuff, you know. Like, his, like, bat was cooler. His gloves were cooler. Everything was cooler. And everybody's like, we just kind of want to be like that dude, right? And so that was kind of my thing. Well, we played him the last game of the season. And as we came up to that last game of the season, I noticed that he took his hat off, and I saw that he had the number 7, which was his jersey number, shaved into the back of his head. And I was like, middle school, right? I was like, that's cool, right? I was like, I want what they got, right? And so it was the last season of the year, so I was kind of bummed. And I was like, I'm going to have to remember this for next baseball season. Well, later that week, we get this phone call, and it says, hey, you know, they called my parents. They said, hey, Brad's on the all-star team. Can he play? And I was like, great. So we show up, and we get to there, and there's my buddy. And he's got his number in the back of the head. And so I kind of like get all the courage, and I get up over to him, and I'm like, hey, man, I said, like how'd you pull that off? You know, because my mom ain't doing that. Like, is there like a special barber you got to go to? Like, how do you get permission for this? What do you do? And so we start talking. He kind of tells me the deal. And I was like, all right, I'm going to do this. Well, as practice is going on, I start having this thought. I was like, why do I just need to do this? I was like, we need to get the whole team to do this. Like, we'll be the coolest all-star team in the Midwest, right? We'll have this shaved in our head. And so later on, practice goes, and we get the team together after, and we're like, we're all going to do this. And so we all go like talk our parents into it. It's this cool thing, right? And so we go through this baseball season and whatever. It's kind of like this dumb thing. We had this. So fast forward a little bit. I'm married, and somehow this story comes up to me and my wife. And she thinks it's like the funniest thing she's ever heard in her life. And so she just starts like making fun of me all the time. And anytime I start to like want to do something weird, she'll always say, cool, it sounds good, number 12. Great idea, right? And like she'll just bring it up like as witty and sharp as she can be, because it's like this mark of this thing, right? And so we were with my parents one time, and she made that joke about number 12. And my mom was like, oh, you think that's funny as I thought that was funny? She goes, well, just know this. I have kept that picture in a folder for as long as I've had, you know, as Brad's, ever since it's happened. She's like, I got that thing. I'm going to hang on to it. And she says, do you want to like take care of the picture of Brad's terrible decision? And Rachel was like, I would never have been more honored to do anything in my life, right? And so she takes this picture. So last night we're laying in bed, and I tell Rachel, I said, hey, you know, I'm going to tell him about the 12 thing. And she goes, do you want to show him the pic? And I was like, what do you mean? She's like, it's right here. And like literally just leans over, grabs the pic, and is like, just remember, kid. You know what I mean? So here, you can see the pic, right? It's wonderful, right? The number 12 in my head. And so this is like the funny version, right? Like, I want what you want, so I'm going to get that, and we're going to make some dumb decisions, and we're going to pay for them for the rest of our lives, right? It's funny when it's a 12 in your head, right? It's not funny when it's the real things, right? It's not funny when it becomes our marriage and we're like, you know, they look like they're having more fun, so we're just going to go start hanging out with these people on Friday nights. So we're just going to start going into this place, and it's going to be great. And, you know, it's just one time. It's just me. It's just this thing. And then this little fold sets in, and it's like this little seed takes root. And all of a sudden, that starts to bear the fruit that's going to bear. And it can turn into a decision that we pay for the rest of our lives. And it starts to be a thing at work, right? Where it's like, I want what they have, and I'm jealous of this, and I can get this. And you know what? If I just like twist this deal up just a little bit, and it's just going to be this one, right? It's always just that one, right? We're just going to make this one a little different, and then all of a sudden we're going to be able to do that this summer, and it's going to be fine, and it's just going to be this one. But that seed gets planted, and the next one, it becomes a little easier to do. And then that thing you wanted, it was fun. And so then we want another one. So we're just going to keep going, and it starts to swell, and then we do it. And the more that we do it, the more we get comfortable with it. The more we get comfortable with it, the less likely we are to hear the voice and the ways of Jesus. And so these things, they're little things. They're these little seeds of jealousy that take root, and we start to say, I want that, and I'm willing to compromise God's ways to get it. And we will rationalize it, and we will say, you know what? It's just me. It's just this one time. I know it's good. And Jesus, I know you're king, and I know you got these great ways, and I know you got all this stuff. But listen, right here, right now, I'm just going to do this my way because I want to be just like them. And so I'm going to do that, and I'm going to sacrifice that. I'm going to compromise that in that place. And the reality is you will pay for that for a very, very, very long time. And so this morning, can we just have that as a gut check to say, like, can we name those places we're jealous? Can we name the places where we're compromising our convictions to go after those things? And as we look at this passage from the Israelites, can we find ourselves in it this morning? And so let's look at it. If you have your Bibles, you can turn to 1 Samuel chapter 8. And as we look there and walk through this, we see some interesting things kind of happen, and we see a lot of humanity and how this happens. And so again, Samuel's a prophet. He's the middleman between God and his people. He's nearing the end of his life. One of his kids is set to take over. His kids are terrible, terrible people. The Israelites see this opening, and they're like, we see you're getting old. We see your kids are bad. And so this is our moment for us to compromise and get exactly what we want. Reject the faithfulness that God has shown us in the past. Reject the faithfulness of God's promises in the future, and we're going to be king right here, right now. And so we look at this, 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 4 and 5. It says, so the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. And they said to him, you got to admire their tact, right? You're old. That's the leading line right there. You're old. And your sons don't follow your ways. They're bad people too. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have. Just in that little bit, you just see this, like their mind's made up. Like this is where they're going. Like you're old, your kids stink. We want this right here, right now. And as we see that, there's just this real sense that they give up faithfully following God and they begin blindly following their friends. They give up faithfully following God's faithfulness that has been there, and they begin following their friends. They begin following these people that they see, that they only see the highlight reel of, and they begin thinking that that's better and that's what they want. So we're going to compromise and sacrifice to get that thing in that place. And they believe that they could do better than God would have for them. And so then in verse 6 he says, but when they said, give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel. Kind of an obvious statement right there, but you get it, right? It says, so he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, listen to all the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but me as their king. And I feel like there's almost like a whole nother sermon right here in that Samuel's given his life to these people. He's invested in all of these people, and when it comes down to the end, there isn't a thank you. There isn't a celebration. There's a, you're old, your kids are a mess. We don't want you anymore. And in that moment, Samuel probably has every reason to just fire back at him. And I'll tell you, we're going to, in a couple weeks, if you want to read through this book, we're going to get to one of the speeches Samuel gives. And it is like one of the greatest putting somebody in their places you've ever read in your life. Okay? And we're going to get to that. So he has those moments, and you can see the way that responds, that like he has that in him. But in this moment, after they say these hurtful words, after they want to tempt him with this, after they bring all this to the table, he simply doesn't react to the moment with his flesh and his response and all the things that there, but he actually steps back and says, how can I respond to this? And the first thing he does is he goes to the Lord in prayer. And he says, God, where do you want, what do we do here? And there's this sense of his acknowledgement, like he's like fulfilling his obligation beautifully. This sense of like, hey, you are to be this intermediary between God and his people, and God's people come with this. And he doesn't lash out at them. He takes that right to God. And he says, what do we need to do here? And then we get to verse 9. And it says right here, where we're at, verse 9, he says, now listen to them, God says. He says, but warn them solemnly and let them know that what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights. And he's like, just let them know what they're stepping into. Okay, and there's a couple kind of key points I want to give you right here as you hear what's about to happen. One, God is not going to approach this as this angry God who wants to spite and smite and control his people. He says these things as a loving father. As he says these things, he's like, you're going to do this, and this is what's going to happen, and you can make your choices, but like, this is just where this path goes, and I'm going to very graciously remind you. And for some of you this morning, reading these words may be a gracious reminder of God checking you in your spirit and the way that you're living your life this morning to say, you are going down a path, and it is not going where you want it to go. And